Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Friday Night Drive Round 2 podcast. I'm Josh Welge, joined here by Steve Soucie and Michael Dwojak. And guys, it's Wednesday. It's a little gray. It's a little cool. It's a little damp. It must be the second round of the playoffs for high school football. How you guys doing today?
Not too bad.
Yeah, can't complain.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us again. Got a lot of good stuff to talk about. Not a lot of upsets in the first round, which makes for pretty good second round fodder. I want to kind of work our way down, start away in 8A. Obviously, one of the matchups that stands out to me, and I'm sure Michael and Soucie as well, Marist hosting Loyola. Marist, if I'm not mistaken, their only loss still is that close one to Joliet Catholic. They've been rolling since. And speaking of rolling, Loyola seems to have definitely found their gear. Michael, I'll start with you. What do you make about that matchup that'll be Saturday at Marist?
It's an interesting matchup because it feels like these are teams that probably shouldn't be playing against each other in week 2. But, obviously that's just how the seeding works. But I think, it'll be interesting to see, how each of these teams' strengths kind of work against each other, right? Where obviously Marist likes to run the ball a lot. And they have obviously got senior quarterback Jacob Ritter who can throw it. But it'll be interesting to see just how much Loyola is able to limit that passing attack for the Red Hawks. And if they're able to do that, I think that they'll really be able to kind of hang in there, and Loyola will be able to pick up a big win. You obviously saw earlier in the season they didn't do that against East St. Louis, and they kind of struggled there against St. Francis when it came to stopping the pass. But, against Mount Carmel, they took away one of the best quarterbacks in the state in Jack Galina. So I think you've seen a lot of progress from them. You've seen a lot of progress, starting from the defensive line all the way to the secondary. So if Loyola is able to limit Marist in their passing attack and just have them run. John McCullough's a really talented running back for the Red Hawks. He's going to Cornell, but there's only so much you can do when Loyola can stack the box against you.
Kind of interesting. Marist head coach Mike Fitzgerald, he's familiar with seeing Loyola in the playoffs. He saw him at York, the last couple of years as well. So a little familiarity there, obviously now in the same conference. Another game that I like in 8A Souce, Fremd playing Naperville Central. Fremd's been a team that, maybe a bit of a surprise this year. I don't know. In the meantime, Naperville Central just quietly stacked wins together throughout the year, except for that one Lincoln Way East game. And I kind of like this matchup too, because Naperville Central, great defense, good defense all year. Fremd's got Johnny O'Brien, great quarterback going to Northwestern. What do you think about that matchup?
Both of these teams have kind of demonstrated over the course of the season that they have a knack to get victories, because you look at Naperville Central, even though that loss with Lincoln Way East kind of spoiled their undefeated season, they had a lot of relatively close calls during the game, a field goal, maybe a touchdown between the two teams in question. So, Naperville Central figuring out a way to get these wins, and then Fremd, their only loss was that touchdown loss, back to Palatine. But they were right in that game. And then other games where you kind of looked at it on paper before the season, you were like, I don't know if Fremd can get them. And they just figured out a way to keep winning those games. So, I mean, you're going to find somebody who's not going to be able to get that job done this week. But both of these two teams have just kind of demonstrated an ability to just kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together in a way that's just good enough to get them behind the team, ahead of the team that's in front of them on the other side. So, both, I guess, kind of strong-willed teams on both sides of the field, I guess, here.
Yeah, this is one of the good stuff for the playoffs. When you get a team from a really good league like the Mid-Suburban League playing a team like Naperville Central, who, DuPage Valley Conference for a long time, now Southwest Valley. But it's fun when you get two really good teams from different leagues together in a game like this. Really look forward to that one. Another one, a Friday night game, a game that I'm going to be at. York is going to be at Oswego. Tell you, Soucie, York, for my money, one of the more impressive, maybe one of the more surprising results of round one. Not that they're necessarily able to beat Edwardsville, but the fact that they're able to put 37 points on the board against a really good defense in Edwardsville. Bruno Masso, their dual threat quarterback, had a huge game. They're going to get another really good defense. Oswego, Oswego, they just keep coming along, winning. But, man, they don't blow teams out. And that kind of, I'm not going to lie, it worries me a little bit this time of year, especially when you got a team like York coming in that's got playoff experience, that's coming off of a really good win.
Yeah, that was interesting. That was a game that, I had caught a little bit of what was going on early in the game, and then I was covering another game. You actually tipped me off to the fact that game had kind of gone off the rails for Edwardsville in terms of York just kind of taking it over. you had sent me a message saying that you were surprised by that during the course of the game. I'm like, whoa, what happened? So I had to go look it up. And, because I did not expect that. I did not expect the margin. I did see it as a game that York could potentially win. But like you, I kind of thought Edwardsville might come out of that with a victory. So obviously way off base on that in regards to the prediction. But York, obviously a solid football team that, despite the coaching change, is still kind of seems to have retained that ability to, be somebody on the other side that you do not want to see laced up against you, because strong enough defensively where they're going to give you some trouble, and seem to be able to do enough offensively to win games against really good football teams.
Yeah, that's going to be a fun game, because there's teams that they hang their hat on running the football, playing good defense. It's going to be a Friday night game on grass. We'll see how grassy or how muddy it is after this week. But some, big time players there. Joe Reif going to Notre Dame. I will say that Oswego, Carson Cooney, linebacker going to Iowa. He got hurt at the end of last week's game, so not sure if he's going to be able to go this week. So that's something to watch. But definitely a fun matchup, round one. Getting down to 7A, and the matchup that I want to start with, matchup that I like, Michael, Fenwick going to Downers Grove North. Interesting matchup from the standpoint of Downers Grove North. While they have a really good defense, what's notable for them is Owen Lansky, their quarterback. Really is on a roll. Really looked good last week against Wheaton South. But man, that Fenwick defense is tough.
Yeah, it is really tough, and I think you saw that against Brother Rice, where Brother Rice, had some success against against that defense, but I just don't. They were really able to limit them, took away the passing game fairly well, defended the run fairly well too. So I'm really interested to see, how much are they able to kind of take away that, Lance to it. I know obviously he's coming back a little bit. I know he's been around after dealing with some injuries, but how much is he able to kind of continue to progress as we get into the playoffs, as we get a little bit colder here? Do you run the ball a little bit more? Is Fenwick able to defend that? So I think that should be a really interesting matchup. And for the offense, obviously Fenwick has a new starting quarterback with Jamin Williams. Doesn't seem like he'll be able to play. Last time I saw on Saturday, he was rolling around in the scooter, so unlikely to play, I would think. So Hosty is coming in for Fenwick. He had some good passes. Fenwick liked to pass a lot, but that's kind of how they scored. So it'll be interesting to see, how quickly can this Fenwick offense come together against a tough defense. And is their identity going to be throwing the ball as much as they did against Brother Rice, or are they going to run the ball a little bit more, knowing that maybe they're not going against as stout of a defense as they did in Brother Rice in round number one?
And speaking of quarterbacks, another game that I like, a game with two really good quarterbacks, St. Charles North going to Mount Carmel. Jack Elliott, great quarterback from Mount Carmel. But man, Ethan Plum has been pretty darn good for St. Charles North too. He just threw for 7 touchdowns last Friday. What do you make about that, man? That could be a game that there's some points scored in that one.
Yeah, this feels like a shootout game to me, just based on how both quarterbacks play, how both offenses go. Mount Carmel's defense is good. Obviously, they've got a bunch of talent, but in these big games, whether it was against the Hun School, against Loyola, they've given up passing yards, and Ryan Fitzgerald made it look fairly easy against that defense, even when he was coming back from an injury. So it feels like a game where Jordan Lynch, Jack Elliott, and that Mount Carmel offense is going to have to figure out ways to kind of keep it going. And, hopefully that defense can get a stop once or twice, because, both of these offenses are dynamic. They both can throw the ball. They both can run the ball. So this feels like a game that's going to be a high-scoring affair. And it feels like pretty much whoever is able to pick up, 1 or 2 stops in the third or fourth quarter, that could define the game. And, I'm kind of looking forward to now this being a low-scoring game where we're going to check over the weekend.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's a 10-6 game or something like that.
Prediction certain to go wrong. Yeah. So speaking of the prediction business, before we get down to 6A, Soucie, there's one other game I wanted to ask you to come on. Batavia playing Lincoln Way West. Batavia's got that playoff history, but you like Lincoln Way West in this game, don't you?
Well, I do. I mean, I think it's a pretty interesting game in a lot of ways. Lincoln Way West, it's just a really experienced team. They have a lot of guys that just are playing with a lot of confidence, just have a lot of varsity experience under their belt. I saw it last Friday against Pekin. It was just kind of like, well, they came out fast and did some good things. A couple things didn't go their way. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, no big problem. Let's just go get back on our keys and take care of business. And I really like that defensive team, especially in the secondary. I think it's an experienced, underrated group. And then when you've got Northwestern recruit Josh Veldman in the middle, where he made a play, a perfectly clean play, where for a second I was actually concerned whether or not the Pekin player was going to get off the turf. I mean, it was one of those, oh my gosh, that kid just got popped. I mean, he's a serious player in the linebacker position in the middle of that defense. So Batavia, obviously they have some great offensive weapons and some guys that can do some things, but I don't think the sledding is going to be particularly easy for Batavia this week.
Speaking of Duquesne Conference teams that have tough second round matchups, going down to 6A, interesting matchup. We'll call this the Matt Rodewald Bowl. Geneva is hosting Burlington Central. Those two teams, or those two schools, only separated by 15 miles. They've never played each other on a football field. Another matchup with really good quarterbacks. Jackson Alcorn for Burlington Central. They just got their first playoff win in 18 years. But Geneva, they really they put that St. Charles North loss behind them. They got a big win last week. What do you make about that one, Soucie?
You mentioned the quarterbacks there, and I think that's interesting. There's two guys in that game that before the season, I didn't know that much about. Now it's like I feel like every week I'm reading a ridiculous stat line for both of them. So basically, I think this is a really interesting matchup. I think Geneva is probably in a little bit better place right now, but it would not surprise me to see Burlington Central give them a run for their money.
Another matchup in 6A. There's some, as I looked at some of the matchups on down through 8A through 1A, there's a few games, there's some matchups with like rematches of regular season and playoff rematches. And one of them in 6A, Libertyville, Lake Forest. Libertyville has just rolled teams most of the year, putting up tons of points, except for Lake Forest. Lake Forest handed their only loss. What do you make of that one?
Yeah, it's very interesting. That conference actually turned out to be a lot different in shape, the way that it kind of came out over the course of the year. I mean, you're used to like Warren being at the top of that league. And then, of course, Warren steps up and beats Palatine in the first round of the playoffs. So I think this was a situation where we just had a really, really deep top of that conference, 3-4 teams that are just really, really good football teams. And for Libertyville, I think maybe Lake Forest might have found them just on that bad week. It's hard to maintain a super high level of performance all week 9s in the regular season. And I think that might have been the week that Lake Forest caught them a little bit off guard, dug a bit of a hole, couldn't get back out of it. I like both of those teams, to be completely honest with you. I like Libertyville to kind of get the revenge for that loss, but once again, I think both of those teams are really good teams. I think they're probably going to have a real dogfight there.
So in 5A, there's a couple matchups at the top that kind of stood out to me involving teams on the one side from the CCL ESCC, and on the other side it's teams that, they like to play that run into football, old school type game. I'm talking about Bennett is at Rochelle, and then St. Francis hosting Prairie Ridge. St. Francis got that big week 9 win over Nazareth. They beat Loyola earlier in the year. They got, they put up tons of points last week. Now they got Prairie Ridge coming in. And then, Bennett, they had a couple losses in midseason. They seem to put it behind them. But going to Rochelle is a tough assignment. Michael, Soucie, what do you guys make of those?
That St. Francis matchup against Prairie Ridge will be really interesting because, there aren't any, triple option ladder running teams in the CCL ESCC. So that's obviously always an interesting dynamic. But, for St. Francis, it seems like they figured things out offensively and defensively as well. And I'm kind of more interested in the defensive way where, St. Francis is able to put up points. Brady Palmer's done a really good job so far. It seems like he's really developed into a really good quarterback, especially later in his junior year. So I don't doubt that St. Francis is going to be able to put up points against Prairie Ridge. I'm more interested to see whether their defense is able to kind of hold up. I feel like we've seen a couple games this year where the defense has kind of given up a bunch of points, given up big plays. And that can happen against an offense like Prairie Ridge that can, break through and get a 67-yard touchdown or something like that. So I'm really interested to see in that matchup whether, can the defense hold up with the offense for St. Francis and pick up a big win for there. And for Bennett, Bennett has shown that they can score a lot of points as well throughout the season. They've obviously competed very well, won the purple title. Can they stop the run and can they stop a pretty good offense for Rochelle. I think that'll be really interesting to see as well because, Bennett has been in a bunch of shootouts so far this season. But I think if they're trying to advance and move forward, you're going to need to pick up a couple of defensive stops here eventually, either whether that's in the second round or in the quarterfinals or semifinals.
Yeah. Another matchup at the bottom of the bracket that I saw, Soucie, when I see second round matchup and I see Joliet Catholic and Sacred Heart Griffin, imagine, I mean, you're talking about some, a couple like blue blood type programs. I think was it 2021? They last met up in the 4A state championship.
Yes.
Admittedly, I don't know about Sacred Heart Griffin, but I have a feeling they probably pass the ball a little bit more than Joliet Catholic.
Yes, they do. And it's one of those situations that's kind of strange to get a read on Sacred Heart Griffin. I was talking about this earlier this week. You don't have a lot of instances where the Sacred Heart Griffin team has lost 4 games in the regular season, but then you have to go and look at what those 4 losses are. And then it's Christian Brothers out of Missouri, one of the best teams in the state of Missouri. Quincy Notre Dame, even though they're a small school, they've proven themselves to be really, really good and are kind of a favorite to win 2A right now. Rochester and Chatham Glenwood. Not exactly slouches on that list. So while they enter this game at 6-4, I don't think you can just say, okay, this is a bad Sacred Heart Griffin team. A nice win for them in the opening round of the playoffs against Mahomet Seymour. You're right. They do like to throw the ball a little bit more than I guess Joliet Catholic would be kind of accustomed to, not seeing a lot of high passing offenses. But, I do like where Joliet Catholic is right now. I feel like that running game is running as well as it has all season. And in the same regard, while Joliet Catholic kind of has to get adapted to maybe seeing more passes, I don't think Sacred Heart Griffin has seen a team that runs the ball quite as well as Joliet Catholic does either. So kind of an interesting matchup. Joliet Catholic's got to go down to Sacred Heart Griffin, so you never know what happens in those kinds of road trips. But, definitely interesting 5A matchup.
Yeah, I mentioned that, some of these, playoff rematches, and one of them stood out to me in 4A, Wheaton Academy playing at St. Lawrence. It's a rematch of last year's 4A semifinal. A really good game. I think it went double over. It at least went one overtime. St. Lawrence got the win. Wheaton Academy has just kind of rolled ever since week 1. They got the one loss to the team out of Texas. They haven't lost since. But, man, St. Lawrence had one of the more impressive round 1 wins, last week, beating Richmond Burton. I think Harley Riz, believe he had a huge game for them. Michael, what do you make about that? I
think the biggest thing you kind of take from that matchup is it seems like St. Lawrence is healthy, right? Like it seems like Harley Riz is back and he's picking up where he kind of left off earlier in the season. Chris Gukowski seems to like he's back. Obviously, he had a big touchdown throw. So it seems like St. Lawrence is back. So I'm interested to see, can they kind of continue that momentum that they were able to have early in the season before dealing with some of those injuries and coming up with some tough losses toward the end of the regular season. And picking up a big 35-17 win over Richmond Burton in the first round is a good way to kind of show that you're back. I know that, Wheaton Academy obviously won 55-19 in their first round matchup, but I think the biggest thing is, I've been talking a lot about defenses and, that kind of proving to be a difference for a lot of these high scoring teams. For St. Lawrence, I think it's going to be, can you keep up with Wheaton Academy and can you kind of score, whether that's throwing the ball for, an electric, 60-yard touchdown pass, 50-yard touchdown pass to build upon the strong running game that you have. So if the St. Lawrence offense is able to kind of continue with the path that it had last week, I think that they should be moving on to the quarterfinals.
Any other 4A games, too, that you're kind of keeping an eye on this weekend in particular?
When you look at 4A in general, I think there are a couple of interesting ones. I look at DePaul Prep actually having an opportunity, I think a pretty good opportunity to possibly get themselves into the quarterfinals here. Maybe set up a CCL battle in there in the quarterfinals with St. Lawrence feeding into the other side of that bracket if they were to win. So a good sign for DePaul, shows how much they've been building that program.
So in 3A, I mean, for my money, maybe the best game of the weekend for any class. Byron going to Montini. It's a rematch of a semifinal last year that Byron won. I believe is by far Byron's. Was it their most difficult game last year? I think it was. Wasn't it? Yeah. And it's a game that, I mean, I'm not taking away from the rest of the 3A bracket, but it could be the 3A state championship game when those two teams meet. Byron, been rolling. They had the one close game with Dixon. If I'm not mistaken, Caden Constantine, they're really fine. Fullback middle linebackers back. Montini, they've been, really been on a roll themselves. A very experienced team, a lot of guys from last year's game, except they got the sophomore quarterback again, Izzy Abrams. It seems like that offense has really been on a roll since he's taken over. What do you think about that one, Michael?
Yeah, that kind of seems to be the bigger difference, right, from last year, where Montini had a good offense last year, but at this point, I think it's at a different level than it was last year with Izzy Abrams taking over here in the second half of the season. I think this defense, it's an interesting matchup because you bring back 10 of your 11 starters from last year's defense, so there's some familiarity with what Byron does. I know obviously Byron is in the same team that they were last year, but still, you're bringing back relatively the same scheme. You're bringing that some of the same playmakers, and I think that plays a role into that. So, again, I think it's just going to be, can the defense pick up big stops here, and can your sophomore quarterback make big plays for you? Obviously, they're going to run the ball. They've got a good running core. Their offensive line is pretty stout, but can Izzy Abrams pick up a first down for you? Can he get you a 15-yard pass or something like that? I think that could be a bigger difference here because, Byron has shown that it can score, even though I know Montini limited them pretty fairly well last year. Is the sophomore quarterback going to be able to make some explosive plays, to get kind of revenge for last year's loss?
Yeah, no, definitely agree on all those. And they're definitely, it's on their mind. I mean, like I went to Montini practice to deliver a MVP belt to their center about a week ago, and I wasn't going to bring it up. I didn't really want to get into any controversy. He brought it up. He was like, I want to talk about Byron. So they definitely got their mind on that. Another rematch from the regular season, a couple of rivals. See if I could say that. St. Joe Ogden, Kelowna Unity. Soucie, they played a really close game earlier in the year. That's another one. Could be a good one.
Yeah, that rivalry has a long history of producing some extremely close and interesting games. The last one was decided by a field goal in the final seconds. It's been a really good bounce back year for St. Joe Ogden, kind of returning them to the top of that league. They've been kind of in the middle of the pack over the last couple of years. Tolona's had a really interesting season in a lot of ways. Started really slow and you didn't know what they were. And then the middle of the year, they threw everyone off by a 1-point loss to Belleville-Althoff that a lot of people didn't see coming. And then over the second half of the season, even though they lost that game, it seems like it kind of springboarded them. They played a lot better in the second half. If you would ask me about this game a month ago, I would have said St. Joe Ogden will probably win comfortably. I am not convinced of that anymore. I think this is going to be a nip-and-tuck battle between these two teams.
Another playoff rematch in 2A, Quincy Notre Dame playing Arthur. Quincy Notre Dame, I believe last year, didn't they knocked off Arthur, last year. That was an upset, but man, Arthur looking pretty good right now.
Well, that was one of those games last year that we talked about a little bit where it was a 1-16 game where you had the 16 seed in Quincy Notre Dame winning that game, winning it somewhat comfortably. And everybody was like, what's going on here? I mean, that shouldn't happen with a 16 and a 1. But Quincy Notre Dame laid the foundation a little bit. They kind of showed us what they were going to be about this year, and they've been excellent. So, winning their division in the Central State 8 Conference, they're a 2A school, like I mentioned before. That conference is littered with 4A, 5A, 6A schools, and some of them are really good. So for them to win a division in that conference, that, to be honest, when they announced that they were joining that conference, my immediate reaction was, I think they're biting off more than they can chew. They showed me. I mean, that was really what it came down to. That's a really, really good football team. I would be really, really surprised if Quincy Notre Dame doesn't take that game.
Yeah. Any other matchups from 2A stand out to you?
2A right now, it's kind of interesting. There's some that I kind of like. I like that Bismarck-Henning-Seneca game. I think that's a pretty interesting one to take a look at. Seneca with their lone loss in the regular season in forever, I think, when they lost to Durand-Pecatonica. But other than that, just kind of churning along with that really good running game. Bismarck-Henning is an interesting program just in the sense that they have a lot of these seasons where they go 9-0 or 8-1 and have a really, really high seed. And I looked into this earlier this week because I was just curious about it. They made the playoffs the last 14 years. They haven't gotten past the second round in all 14 of those years, despite having a high seed and a good record. So for them, I'm sure they'd like to clear that obstacle and put that narrative to rest. So I think that's a pretty interesting game to look at in 2A.
In 1A, there wasn't too many upsets, quotation mark upsets, seeds wise and stuff. But two of them involved, I believe, Ottawa, Marquette, and Galina both were able to get, again, quote unquote upsets. Maybe they weren't, but it's certainly the seeds they were, and makes for an interesting second round game. Yeah,
it does, and that's one of the things about that matchup in particular. You look at what Ottawa Marquette did; they won over a Lincoln Trail Conference team. Galina did the same. That league in general didn't do very well in the first round of the playoffs. The Lincoln Trail, that is. So Lincoln Trail Prairie Land, or whatever it's called now, it's a combination of two conferences. I always forget the consolidated name, but both of those teams came up big. Both of them did it in a fashion that was pretty impressive. Galina, with their win, the 1-point win, they're from the NUIC. They know how to get things done this time of year. So that didn't really surprise me all that much in winning that game. The margin that Ottawa Marquette won in was pretty surprising to me. But other than that, 1A was kind of chalky. I thought the most notable things that kind of came out of that was Belleville-Althoff did get De'Air Hill back on the field, the Oregon recruit. I mean, he was out there. Belleville-Althoff coast. If they're at full strength, I still think they're the favorite in this conference. But one thing I did notice this week is Lena Winslow put a huge number of points on Clifton Central in the first half of their 1A playoff game. And it's almost like Lena Winslow is like trying to tell everybody, hey, guys, we're still here. Don't forget about us. Granted, that was kind of be expected. That was a 2 seed against a 15, a 5-4 team at the bottom of there. But the dominance that Lena Winslow displayed to me was like just kind of giving everybody a little subtle reminder of, hey, let's not engrave the trophy just yet, guys.
I was going to say, they get a conference rival this week with Stockton, who played them pretty well, but maybe they're going to get a different version of Lena Winslow this time. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that could very well be the case.
A lot of good football this weekend. Before we get out of here, final thoughts. I'll start with you, Michael. What are you looking at with some of those CCL teams?
It'll be really interesting to see just how many are able to survive, right? I feel like you kind of look at the matchups and you're like, well, CCL, and, obviously they've been battle tested, but there are a lot of tough matchups, Mount Carmel and Fenwick, especially in 7A, going off against, top 10, top 15 teams. There's only so much, that experience gets you. So it'll be really interesting to see how those matches play out, how the 5A bracket plays out. Do we get some semifinals or quarterfinals with CCL, ESCC matchups in 4A too? And that Loyola Marist rivalry in the playoffs has been really interesting over the past 5 or 6 years. I know, I forget what year it was. I think it might have been 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago at this point because of the pandemic. But Loyola was riding high. They were trying to get back to the state championship, and Marist upset them pretty well up in Wilmette. So, once we get into the second round of the playoffs, I feel like you think like, well, there are going to be a bunch of blowouts, but I don't foresee that at all for the CCL against CC. I think there are going to be a lot of shootouts, a lot of close games, and I think that the mega conference could, they could have a high amount of teams, making it to the quarterfinals, or a bunch could just fall off because of, how good these second round matchups are.
Well, and Soucie, the other thing is Michael mentioned the number of blowouts in the first round. They're just, again, I mentioned off the top, there just was not, very many upsets in round one, which you don't see too many upsets too often, but it makes for really good second round games.
Yeah, a lot of underseeds did win in the first round, but a lot of those were kinds that you could see coming. It was either they were seated lower, they were playing maybe a Chicago Public League school in the opening round. So, I want to say of I think there were, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 26 underseeds that won in the first round. But at least 20 of those were games where I was like, that's pretty much what I thought was going to happen. So, that created a whole bunch of second round matchups that on paper look really, really interesting. Now, how do they play out that way? I don't know. But, I think the one classification that kind of stands out to me for various reasons, I feel like almost every one of those 7A second round games is interesting in some way, shape, or form. Not all the classifications have that, but I think that's one where you can look at almost every one of those 8 games and say, I can make a case for either one of these two teams. And if you can do that, even if it's a bit of a flimsy case, those are the ones that usually make for interesting games. So I'm really kind of looking forward to see how that all plays out and which 8 teams are left standing, not only in 7A, but all of the other classifications, because there are some where there's going to be a really good team that gets beat because there are 2 really good teams playing in that game in front of them. So, if you would have said, who do you think are the 8 best teams in this classification before the tournament started, it's impossible for you to reassemble that list in the quarterfinals because some of those 8 teams that you mentioned are going to be matching up here in round 2.
No doubt about that. A lot of good stuff, a lot of good football, a lot of good stuff coming on a Friday Night Drive. We'll be covering all weekend, Friday and Saturday. Again, for Steve Soucie and Michael Dwojak, I'm Josh Welge. Everybody have a good Wednesday afternoon.